Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's webinar, Property and Finance, your blueprint to a smarter property decisions. We're glad you could join us this evening for this exciting session where it's designed for our doctors and for medical professionals. We have some great speakers tonight from Cutcher Neale, our platinum partner, and also PMC property buyers. We'll take you through the presentation. But first, I'd like to do acknowledgement to country. We'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land in which we work and live. We pay our respect to elders past, present, and extend our respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. My name is Kathy Gall and I'm a membership lead at AMA Queensland. I'll be introducing our speakers a little bit later, but first I'd like to do some housekeeping. The presentation tonight will take about 1 hour and we will be taking questions through the webinar. We do have a chat box there where you can put your questions in there and we will attend to those questions at the end of the webinar. I did want to point out that Cutcher Neale is our platinum partner, and for members, we do offer 1 hour free consultation. So it's important to remember that because some of the questions won't be able to answer tonight, and so you can ask them in your 1 hour free session with them. Before we start the presentation, I wanted to just mention that we are now live in our, we have now launched our digital upgrade. So you will notice difference within the member portal. We do encourage our members to set up their new username and login and also their MFA and go through and explore our new member portal and also our new website and update any details that you need. We also do have some great events coming up this year still. We do have our annual conference in Vancouver, which is in September. And it's a great event where you can earn CPD home points, but you also can go on a holiday with your family as well at the same time. The next event we do have it coming up this year is our much loved Women in Medicine breakfast. This year it's going to be at Victoria Park and it will be on Thursday morning of the 30th of October. For our students who are graduating and going to be interns next year, we are running our regular intern workshops and these are free events. So we do encourage you to come along. We are holding one in Brisbane on the 27th of November, in Gold Coast on the 4th of December, and we will also be in Townsville on the 17th of December. So that's any students, medical students who are graduating this year and going to do their internship next year. It's a great event. It will give you a lot of tips and tricks. We'll have our union partner with us that will go through different industrial relations, things that might come up through your intern years. Also down on the Gold Coast, we are running our third event of our series, the Private Practice Refreshed, and so that will be on the 5th of December, and that's a great way to have a refresh of your private practice business. Following that event, we do have our member networking event, which is on the same day, the 5th of Friday, the 5th of December, and we do encourage all our members to attend that event and to enjoy the networking sessions. Okay, so going on to tonight's webinar, we do have a guest speaker, Josh Holt from Cutcher Neale. He's the credit advisor, and what the topics tonight we're going to go through is buying your first home. It's easier than you think. Exclusive the medical lending policies, smart loan structuring strategies, supercharge your property portfolio, and what makes property investment grade. And I'd like to now welcome Josh from Cutcher Neale.
Thanks, Kathy, and thanks everyone who's joined us tonight. It's nice to have some in-person presence as well as those who've taken the time online. Look forward to speaking to you. As Kathy mentioned, we've got a few topics to cover off before James will step up and give us an update in terms of what the property market's looking like in both Queensland and the wider country. So quite a few things to cover off, so we'll get started. As Kathy mentioned, I work for Cutcher Neale, an accounting and financial services firm that's been around for over 70 years. We have quite a specialty in the medical sector, which is why we're so eager to support you up here in Queensland and all across the country. And our key goal is to help you provide comfort and clarity in your financial future. So how we do that is by our 7 pillars for success. So I'll be here tonight to talk to you about your finance and cash flow. That's just one of our 7 pillars, which you can see here on the screen. The pillars are designed to help you not only build your financial future and make sure that you've got your goals set out and are achievable, but also once you're on that path to achieving those goals, that you're taking the right steps to ensure that you're protecting them as well. So as Kathy mentioned, we do offer free hour-long consultations, not just with me, but with the partners of our firm or relevant stakeholders, depending on your needs, to help go through various aspects of these 7 pillars. And before we get started, I thought it might be a good place for us to discuss how we're looking in terms of the economic outlook in Australia and to do with interest rates, which are affecting us from a borrowing standpoint. So recently, as of last Tuesday, the RBA did decrease the cash rate, which now sits at 3.60%, the third decrease over the last 12 months, after about 12 months of stagnation in the interest rates. This was predicted earlier in the year that we were going to see some cuts and maybe even a few more were predicted. Potentially there is scope for a little bit more, although we have seen inflation slow down, although the cost of living still remains high. Whether we'll see those sooner or if those extra decreases will be spread out may depend on whether some more global events start to affect us, whether that be like the tariffs or other global conflicts that have caused some disruptions in the market so far this year. What does that mean for you in terms of borrowing? Well, on average, if you've got $100,000 in loan, a 0.25% decrease is around $15. So in this situation we're in with a difficult time for cost of living, that extra money in your back pocket can be quite helpful. Now would be a good time, especially if you do have existing mortgages, to evaluate the interest rates. From my perspective, I've seen the banks pretty much pass on these discounts so far this year without hesitation. In fact, some of them have the media releases locked and loaded, ready to go, and you'll see them come out mere minutes after the RBA announcement is made. And also in terms of pricing new loans, sometimes they may try and make up the discounts there. That hasn't generally been the case. They've been quite good in passing on the discounts so far. But regardless, it is a good time not just to evaluate existing mortgage interest rates, but potentially use that as an opportunity to maybe assess your equity levels in your property, as this is going to be probably a key theme of our discussion this evening. So I know we have some experienced campaigners here and also online, but just to cover off the basics, when I'm talking about equity, I'm talking about value in your home that isn't currently potentially used for borrowing. So if you've purchased a $1 million home and you have a $950,000 mortgage, well, your equity is pretty well tapped out at 95% loan to value ratio. As a doctor or a dentist or medical professionals, you have access to high LVRs without paying lenders mortgage insurance, which is a key saving that you can make and a key reduction in your barriers to entry in the market. Building up that equity, whilst it starts out where you haven't really got any in the property, James will talk about capital growth in property and locations later, but as that grows, leveraging that unused borrowing and as equity grows through your capital growth, whether that's through the property value increasing or you paying down your mortgage, ideally a combination of both, that will give you opportunity to to then enter the market and maybe use some of those funds towards an additional property. However, the current changes in the economic outlook and the changes, especially in the market for first home buyers, have seen both state and federal governments recently make changes in order to boost first home buyers in their ability to enter the market, as they're currently finding it quite difficult. So I'll quickly cover off some of the recent changes in those areas that may have flow-on effects to both first home buyers. As a doctor, may or may not help, but also in the investor market, some of these changes could have flow-on effects to your cost to enter as well. So from a stamp duty perspective, Queensland government did announce that for eligible new properties, so those are properties that haven't been built in previously, first home buyers would be have their stamp duty costs waived, regardless of the purchase price. That's been in effect since May this year. They also, about 12, 18 months ago, lifted up the threshold on existing homes, so those are dwellings that are already occupied, to 700,000 for waiving stamp duty, and then giving a concessional rate up to 800,000. For the first homeowner grant, which is the $30,000 cash payment that first homeowners get, again for newly built properties that haven't been occupied before, they extended the date upon which they'll continue to pay that $30,000 until 30 June 2026, at which stage it'll reduce to $15,000. That was scheduled to happen about 2 months ago, but the government again announced an extension to keep up some grants and to help first home buyers in the market. They also made a change where not only can you access these schemes, but they've relaxed rules regarding first home buyers who might buy a premises, have some spare space, and look to generate some income from renting out a spare room. Previously, that was frowned upon to some degree. Now you can look to utilise that without necessarily impacting your eligibility for either scheme. The federal home guarantee scheme is again a first home buyer scheme for people who can't normally access the 95% LVRs. So as a doctor, as a dentist, as a medical professional, you can already get to that on both owner-occupied and investment purchases. The regular first home buyer couldn't, if not for this scheme. This scheme at the moment has income caps. As you can see here, sitting at 125 for individuals and 200,000 for joint. Has a purchase price cap around $700,000 in Brisbane at the moment. It's different for different cities and states. And at the moment, there's 33 lenders and about 35,000 places. Well, as of start of January next year, the income thresholds will be removed, the purchase price limit will be removed, and there'll be unlimited places available. So we may see some competition into the market for clients who may have been priced out of entering the market due to not having the deposit to enter at the level they can borrow, but earning maybe too much to enter the scheme. That'll no longer be the case. That won't be a hurdle for them. And if they can get a spot in the scheme, then suddenly some access to properties that were off their radar might suddenly appear. We may see some competition there in the market that didn't otherwise exist. The other big change, which is quite a new scheme, is both federal and state legislated, and they're different schemes. There's the Help to Buy scheme and the Boost to Buy scheme. Now, Help to Buy is federal, whereas Boost to Buy is what Queensland are calling their shared equity scheme. The shared equity scheme is where the government will purchase a percentage of your property with you and share ownership in that property. You can enter the market with as little as 2% deposit. The contribution from the government will vary depending on whether it's a new build or if it's an existing dwelling. There will be income caps on this particular policy, and it's due to launch later this year. Some clients might get into a situation where they're suddenly presented with a choice that they didn't have to make before, of whether they enter these shared equity schemes or stay out of it and proceed with potentially their 95% borrow and just using their own capital. So there may be arguments for both. It's a new scheme. We haven't seen much of it historically that I can see to really gauge how this is going to go. But if we look at it from a higher level perspective of what the options could mean, well, if you decide to go ahead with the shared equity scheme, may have a lower borrowing requirement up front. That might be beneficial, but that will also depend on your strategy, your risk appetite. You might also find greater affordability. You might be able to enter markets you couldn't otherwise enter because the government's also chipping in funds to help you to purchase. Why might you not choose to use this scheme? Well, again, going back to equity, if the government is buying 30% of your property, as your property grows, the 30% is going to grow as well. If you own the property 100%, that capital growth remains all yours. That helps your flexibility for future borrowing, again, accessing equity potentially for investment portfolios. And it also helps where if you do have to exit the property due to whatever circumstance that may be, you don't have to worry about the prospect of paying out funds to the government. How do you pay out the government? Well, there's 3 ways to do it. That can happen at the sale of a property. You can refinance your mortgage at a time where equity growth has meant that and your borrowing power supports borrowing enough to pay them out. Or if you come into cash in other ways, you can pay out via cash. But all buyouts are at current market value. So again, if you've bought something and there's been growth in there, part of that growth belongs to the government if you enter this scheme. So if we look at an example, for instance, at an $800,000 purchase price, where the government has bought a 25% share, stamp duty costs remain the same. The deposit is 5% versus 2%. So the actual entry costs aren't too different. The difference is in the loan, 544,000 versus 760,000. So the big difference there really is, especially if you're a single borrower, potentially getting up to a purchase price or that you wouldn't otherwise access because your sole borrowing power might not have been enough otherwise. But this graph that I've included also shows a bit of a comparison. Use the 5% property growth rate over a 5-year timeline where the person who bought without the government has seen 100,000 difference in capital growth because of their decision to go solo on this purchase rather than include the government. And as you can imagine, as that time expands, and if you don't pay out the government, that gap will only widen. So thinking about ways to enter the market potentially where you can avoid that situation, keep that equity for yourself. Well, a very popular strategy at the moment is leveraging the bank of mum and dad. So that can be using residential equity, so an unencumbered property potentially that the parents own, or can be done using cash, for instance, money put into a term deposit. The parents would still get bank interest rate on the term deposit while it's in there. It just would be inaccessible until the guarantee is released. So in this example, the bank will only lend 80% and then will leverage the parents to provide the additional 20%. And in this example, the client can afford an $825,000 loan for the $800,000 purchase. So they're borrowing 100% of the cost plus the stamp duty. The parents are providing a guarantee, which is the 20% deposit and the stamp duty costs, whether that through their property or through the cash. This can be done not just for owner-occupied properties, it can be done for investment properties as well. So if you've already bought a home, but you haven't got access to enough equity growth to potentially go ahead with the second property, but you do have the borrowing power, well, you can still utilize this for a secondary property. It does not assist you with borrowing capacity. So the parents are helping provide additional security. They're making sure that the bank's happy with the loan to value ratio. They're happy with the risk of the transaction, but the support doesn't increase how much debt is available to the child or children. And the borrower has to still be able to service the debt. Just because the parents are involved, it doesn't mean you can get an extra amount that you can't pay. You still have to be able to pay. Now, I mentioned 80%. That is the amount that the bank will take initially against the purchased property. However, as a doctor, as a dentist, as a medical professional, you can release that guarantee once your property growth or once your equity has, LVR, has gotten down to 95%. So in this example, if the property is grown to say $860,000, that's about 8% growth. and the loan has decreased just slightly, even to 815,000. By that stage, we're below the 95% loan to value ratio. We organise a bank valuation on the property and show the bank, and they're happy to release the security, whether that is the property for the parents or their cash. If that strategy doesn't work, or if there are simpler arrangements available, other strategies we see with the bank of mum and dad are often related to money that's gifted or loaned. That could be one of a few ways, whether that's a loan with repayments, a loan where you're not making repayments, but the final amount is reduced from the estate in years to come. A cash gift, which ideal for the borrower, but that's not always possible. But you've got to note that if it is a private loan and it is repayable with terms, often we see solicitors, for instance, draw up a private loan agreement and possibly even a second mortgage get registered. Those repayments really are declarable to the bank and can affect the upfront borrowing power. Opportunity cost is just something worthwhile discussing. No one should make a decision based on past regrets by any means. But if you're considering a purchase and then don't make that transaction and think, oh, I'll come back to it at a later time, well, there is a cost to doing so. Hopefully no one here owns this property, but I've used this example off the market. This is in Highgate Hill. You can see the property sold in May 2013 for 997,000, sold again 2 years later for 1.125 million, and then is currently for sale for offers over 2.2 million. So that's 6.82% growth rate. That's a good return, and it's a measurable cost in terms of not acting. Other strategies in terms of potentially achieving a goal in alternative ways, I'll say, is looking just beyond your interest rate. There are lenders out there that will look at you differently as a client, and these could be non-traditional lenders that the average borrower won't know who they are, but they are out there, and we can help you find them if needed. They can offer potentially higher borrowing capacities, and sometimes that comes at a premium of your interest rate. So in this example, a second-year Queensland Health couple on combined $200,000 household income, that's just based on a second-year Queensland Health base rate of about 98,000. Of course, you'd be both working overtime, but for this example, we'll leave it out. Both have HECS, both have $15,000 credit cards to get rewards points for frequent flyers, so you can buy a toaster or whatever you get for them these days, and paying $400 a month in health insurance. In this example, there are lenders here, and you can see, you can't see a major bank. You can't even really see a medium-sized bank, I would say, like a Macquarie, ING on this list. But there are banks out there who will lend higher amounts, and potentially that could be the difference between accessing your 2 better to your 3 better property, for instance. I will say that if that same client came to us and used policies that we have access to, they'd be able to borrow more than any of these lenders at a rate better than anything displayed there. So always check with me first. Okay, so that's just some of the updates in terms of policies that we have going on in Queensland specifically, some of the strategies to consider, especially in entering the market, and then the next step being potentially having found that first home, which again, we've used the same example from before, that $800,000 home, and then looking at leveraging that towards an additional transaction or additional purchase in the future. So just assuming, again, your 5% growth rate, the value after 5 years for this home is 1.02 million. The loan balance is around 700,000. So you're sitting around a 70% loan to value ratio. Your equity has grown quite well in that time. And then you look towards opportunities to leverage that for other purchases and growth in your property portfolio. So in this instance, that couple, they've both moved on in their training. They're both either in their specialty training or very late stage of their public hospital careers potentially. they've got their current property value, they're interested in a purchase that they can afford of around 1.625 million. The borrowing power is there. So the value of both the current property at its current value and then the new purchase is about 2.65 million. They can borrow up to 95%, not just on the owner-occupied property, but the investment one too. So that available equity is just over 2.5 million. Take away their current home loan, they've got funding available still in terms of equity of still over $1.8 million. So if they go ahead with that $1.625 million purchase, it's hit with stamp duty costs around $73,000, zero lender's mortgage insurance because the LVRs remain under 95%, and the medical professionals. And the total cost to complete is nearly 1.7 million. So they've been able to borrow using equity in their home, the purchase price, the stamp duty costs, they can afford the loan. They've upgraded their home, they've kept the original property as an investment. The now $700,000 debt is investment debt that's helping them from a negative gearing perspective, and they're on the next step of their property portfolio. And potentially have found a home, for their growing family. So utilising a strategy like this, especially using the policies that you have access to, is where you can accelerate this property portfolio. So again, 15 years later, we're looking at the same couple. They're both specialists, or they've both found their calling in terms of their career. The existing household income has increased, property values have increased, they've been able to pay down some debt, been able to continually leverage the equity in their home using cross-securitizing to their benefit in order to attain further property purchases. Again, they have access up to 95% loan-to-value ratio on those purchases, so they really only need equity for that 5% deposit and stamp duty costs each time. And they've turned what would otherwise be possibly a dream into a reality. Small percentage of Australians own 6 properties. I would say around 1% at best. But for people in this career, for people who have these aspirations and are on this path, it's definitely possible. You might get to a point where you may have reached the capacity in terms of borrowing power within traditional structures. So that may be you've got 2-3 investment properties, you've geared up highly on them, you've got your home, you've got other debt, maybe you've taken out strategies to turn your home loan debt into other deductible debt, which can be talked about in more detail with our accountants. But you may get to the point where further borrowing in your individual names may no longer be possible. But you may still have aspirations to grow and grow that property portfolio. You may want to also diversify in terms of the risk, in terms of where you're going to see the benefit. And commonly, that's where we see commercial investment as an answer. And for those who have reached those points in their careers, usually this is specialists, and they may already be out on their own. They may be about to go back out on their own. They may be by themselves, or they may be in a group of like-minded individuals in a similar specialty, and they may elect to use their self-managed super fund, or use their self-managed super fund or a property trust in combination with other doctors and form a larger unit trust to purchase a commercial premises, usually a practice and usually an owner-occupied basis, based on them working out of that building using the service trust or whatever their practicing entity is. That may not just be solely owner-occupied. Sometimes the buildings will be quite well fit out. There'll be rooms available for rent. You can get other specialists in, other types of businesses even. But using these structures is a way of further building your wealth by getting maybe your practicing entity to pay your self-managed super fund rent. Maybe getting your practice entity to pay the unit trust rent, and then the unit trust disperses appropriately from there to the relevant members. So if you've capped out your borrowing in terms of your personal borrowing power, that doesn't mean that options aren't there to diversify further and look into alternate options, and commercial may be the answer for that. You have access to good policies, so 90% LVR for SMSF. Realistically, that's based on an owner-occupied basis. If you're investing, you can knock 5-10% off that at best. Unit trust funding, you can get up to 100% of the purchase price if the deal's strong enough. And that realistically, that is the journey when it comes to property, especially as for medical professionals and the typical cases that we see. They start out on this family home and then progress through those investment properties. And then as their career progresses, they look into ways to diversify, and we're able to help them to find those avenues and utilize the significantly strong policies that are available. Banks, whether they be residential banks or commercial banks, like doctors, and they put these policies aside for when you're ready to access them. So I'd be happy to discuss those in more detail with anyone who's interested. So you can catch me afterwards. We have time for questions at the end. You can reach out separately. But that's essentially everything I wanted to cover off. So thanks for listening, and you're in good hands with James now as we go over some current property updates. Thank you.
Thank you for having me tonight, everyone. Thank you for coming out tonight on a chilly, rainy night, and for everyone online as well. So my name's James. I run a company called PMC Property Buyers. So we run a buyers agency business nationally. But essentially tonight we're going to cover off on Southeast Queensland market conditions. So we'll talk between Sunshine through to the Gold Coast. What to consider if going down the path of buying property, whether it's a home or as an investment. Price points, bit of cash flow piece, and just sort of that process of purchasing, primarily more directed at the first home buyers and getting into that market. So
one more, mate.
All right,
Is
there
that
we go.
going to be your next slide?
Whatever it was, that's all good. So to give you a bit of background on who we are, so we run a buyers agency business. We have a national research advisory division that tracks the 32 largest population bases in the country. We've got offices in Brisbane, Gold Coast, Sunshine Coast, Newcastle, Sydney, Melbourne, and then joint ventures nationally. So the idea being that when people are trying to buy property or they're doing investment, it's not always going to be Brisbane, even though we're all here. It's not necessarily going to be exactly where we're going to be. There might be other markets where we think there's better advantages in the short term. We've got a team of just over 50 in the different states, and then the research division is separate to that. So to give you an idea, obviously Brisbane, we've got the Olympics announcement, which took however long it took to finally get the stadium announcement. Evidently there's seminars at Vic Park at the end of the year, so clearly Vic Park's still going to be in progress well after that. But stadium's obviously going to go in through there. We've got the Dexus Eagle Street development, which if you go into the city at all, you'll still see it's a giant hole that's full of water. So that might be a little bit longer till it gets out, but they are still pushing forward. So they're probably our two largest projects that are going on obviously at the moment. And then you've still got Cross River Rail, which is about 6 years behind schedule, but is still on its way to come out, and a few other projects as well. So how is Southeast Queensland, or in particular at the moment Brisbane, performing? You can see those stats there on the screen. This is for what's happened so far this year. So we've still hit a 7% growth rate, and this was as of, I think, about middle of July. So the stats would have been to the end of June. So Brisbane still performed well. That dip where you can see it sort of dipped in below the growth rate in 22-23. If you look at Josh's economic chart, you see that sharp spike in interest rates at that stage. And that's very much correlated with that. But Brisbane values, you can see there, are currently at a record high. And, every time we have any growth phase from here on in, it will always be at a new record high. So it's nothing to be alarmed about, but it is something to obviously take into consideration. So how are we going compared to the other states regionally? When you look at a few of those regional markets, they've been performing extremely well. Adelaide and Perth, I'll talk to you about property clocks and bits and pieces a little bit later on. But you can see Brisbane's still performing very well compared to the majority of the other capitals. The interesting one there is still Melbourne, and this is obviously growth thus far this year. Melbourne's stats still come through as negative, but we're just starting to see a little bit of a shift in momentum in that market at the moment. So Brisbane, what is actually still driving it? We're all here. We've all seen the prices move since COVID, especially at a very, very rapid rate over that 3 to 5 year period leading up to now. At some point, that level of growth and that speed of growth will have to slow. It can't keep running at the speed that it's running at the moment. So the drivers still, though, for South East Queensland is population growth is our number one. We just have so many more people still coming in than the housing we can provide. Yeah, that's not a full state situation, primarily a South East Queensland situation. If you're going up to Northern Queensland, there's still plenty of housing available, so we don't see those shortages there. It is an unlikely change in the short to medium term future, though, to see that change. Obviously, we've still got infrastructure, we've got projects. The Olympics is still on pretty much every investor that inquires to our business saying they want to buy in Brisbane because of the Olympics. That's a 7-year window. We've got to think and make sure the market's a long-term market to be investing in as well. But it's definitely a city now where you've seen Santos is moving their head office up to Brisbane. There's a number of other larger firms that are just shipping people in from interstate and putting their head offices up here in Brisbane. So we're now starting to come a little bit more on the map from a financial services perspective as well. And naturally, we're just more calm, laid-back sort of people, right? Like we're happy to just live life and enjoy it. So we'll get into some of the more critical elements now. So population growth and dwelling approvals. So I've got a couple of slides talking about construction as well. So according to the HIA, there's you may be aware of the government project to try and build 1.2 million houses. So we've got to hit 20,000 a month nationally in order to meet that target. At the moment, we're sitting, and I think we're only 12 months into the project, and we're sitting about nearly 20% below the right. So you can see the average number of units. The most alarming thing here is where you're looking at that decade average of units in the pink. There's a lot of periods there over the last 6 or 7 years where we've been well below that average line. And the biggest concern with apartments coming out of the ground, you'll see shortly. So this is the impact of population growth and our ability to keep up. So Urbis is a very trusted industry body in that construction world. So they're saying that a third of Brisbane's apartments may actually never be built. It's already been approved, may not actually ever come to fruition. The second one there where you're talking approval through to completion. So originally you'd have get your DA, then they'll go through a funding process, they'll get the pre-sales, get it out of the ground and start building, have it completed within 45 months. So that's, what's that, 4 years? Yeah. Now that's blowing out to sort of 70. So if we think about what we've got a house between here and the Olympics, that's in 7 years' time. So essentially, it was taking 6.5 years for the majority of these to come through. What gets approved now will only just be finished by the time we hit the Olympics. And you can see there how many we have to build in South East Queensland alone in order to keep up. I was talking with a construction manager the other week around units and high-rise units to get out of the ground as well, because naturally to get dense supply, you get a complex that's got 300 units, that obviously helps. But the ability to fund that, there's very few companies that can now afford to do that. So you've got Meriton, Harry Triggerboff, he's a self-funded billionaire, so he can actually do it. But there's only him and maybe 1 or 2 others that have the physical financial capacity to fund those large-scale high-rise apartment complexes. So I think especially in South East Queensland, we're probably going to really start to see that slow down. Your Mosaics, your Greyers, they're more now specialising on your luxury 3-bed apartments to accommodate for downsizing, as opposed to investment and more sort of built to rent sort of stuff. So where do we see the market at the moment? We'll talk a little bit around our property clock. So this is the property clock that us combined with Performance Property Research go and produce. We do this on a monthly basis every review, but it's more a quarterly update. So essentially the peak is top of the market. Then as we go down, as the clock would, as it goes around 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, it's a stagnation, a bit more risk of downside. It may not actually go backwards. There's risk of that. You get down towards the bottom where you're starting to see value, and then you go back up and through the cycle again. So this is where we're seeing housing. The dark blue is what we classify as a foundation asset, where you can hold that for 10 plus years or you can hold it forever. Average growth rate in those suburbs, in those cities, has to have been a minimum of 6.5% per annum as an average over the last 40 years. We have data. When you get to a trading asset, is more something that you can buy, hold while the market is performing well, but it's not the sort of asset that you'd hold when it slows down, because that market could plateau for a very long period of time. So that's where we're seeing the housing market. You can see Brisbane's in that sort of hold pattern at the moment. That doesn't necessarily mean you need to hold, but if you're thinking about buying for the first time and getting into the market, you're getting towards the upper end of that cycle. The cycles can range from start to finish. You could have a 8-year cycle. Your regional areas tend to have shorter cycles where you'll have a couple of years of growth and then a couple of years of quieter times. The unit market, you can see there's not a lot of units that we would say from a historical growth rate will maintain that over the long term. Sydney and Melbourne are the two that actually have the historical growth rate to support our grading, and that's not everybody's grading, that's just our grading. But you can see those markets are getting a little bit behind where the housing market is. Housing markets tend to be moving first and the unit market starts to catch up. So Brisbane, you can still see that the unit market's still moving and is pretty buoyant at the moment. So Melbourne is one market. If you go back there, you can see obviously the housing market's right at the bottom, the unit market's right at the bottom. So why is it that we actually are investing in Melbourne? So we started buying Melbourne for clients in November last year. From an investment perspective, we think there's going to be plenty of upside there, whether that's quick growth or whether it's a more stable, gradual growth. We're probably the latter, not the former. But they're now starting to get the Victorian population now starting to grow again. So had many years around COVID where everyone was a big exodus. Now there's a lot of people coming back. There's significant diversity of employment, which I'll show you in one of the coming up slides. And then once buyer sentiment starts to improve and you start to see that move, you don't actually need any fundamental reason, which is the fascinating thing about property markets. It doesn't need to be a fundamental reason for it to move, but the momentum of your taxi driver and your Uber driver and everyone else telling you that market's going pushes everyone into that market and away we go. So that's not what I'm saying is the reason that the market should be moving, but the reality is that can happen. So when you're looking, so this is one of the reasons when you look at that disparity of Sydney house prices to Melbourne house prices, right? So there's a significant difference. You can see the grey bars being Sydney just continuing to creep along and Melbourne sort of levelled out or backed off over the last few years. So that's a significant difference between the pricing, which again isn't a fundamental reason why it should move, but when you're talking about such a large city and population growth, it's a good indicator. Diversity of employment for Melbourne as well is huge, but you do have a significant portion of the financial and professional services, so strong income in that market. So your dual income households have got plenty of income, disposable income as well. So we are starting to see that. And that we think that will still continue to push the market. There's naturally some negatives associated with Victoria at the moment. State government's broke. That's a pretty big one. Land tax is another fairly big one. They're hitting on everyone. The land tax is actually a very small value, even though it starts at $1. It's very low. So even when you compare it to buying property, say in Southeast Queensland, you might end up about $1,500 to $2,000 a year difference for a property around 1.1 million. So it's not a groundbreaking reason not to go and buy a property there, but it has to be a consideration because it is an annual tax that you will have to pay. Obviously, I can't give you accounting advice, but it is a tax deduction. So from a property selection perspective, we'll just sort of talk about how we go about property investment when we're recommending that for clients. So we'll talk about some of the due diligence and investigations that we as a business do. Oops. Okay, cool. No, that's all right. So what we're going to look at is just really what to consider. So when you're thinking about buying property, there's a whole lot of different elements that will move the market. So it'll be and move the demand for a particular market. So it could be school catchment zones, it'll be your vacancy rates, it'll be what are the demographics like, the home buyer appeal, the proximity to transport, all of these sorts of things we have to take into account. One of those is obviously vacancy rates if you're buying as an investment property. We want to know that we're not going to have heaps of supply. It's going to be very, very difficult to rent. We won't be able to increase our rent over time. So the equilibrium for vacancy rates is considered to be 3%. So that's the balance of demand and supply. Anything above 3% is considered oversupplied and under 3% is considered undersupplied. So if you see a market where the vacancy rate is lower than 3%, generally indicates you should be able to rent your property out within a couple of weeks if you're in line with market. So you can see Melbourne, Sunshine Coast, Gold Coast, Brisbane, everybody is sitting well below that 3% mark. Melbourne's started to have a little bit of a spike. A lot of that is due to that urban sprawl and the availability of development that's out in the more regional parts of Melbourne as opposed to inner city. And then you can see Brisbane, Gold Coast, Sunshine Coast still extremely low. So some of the other due diligence that we look into, school catchment zones wasn't as big a deciding factor for people buying about 5, 6, 7 years ago. As cost of living pressure is now starting to take into effect, more and more people are talking about it. It's becoming a costly exercise for private schools. Those school catchment zones you would genuinely see from one street out to one street in. If you're in some of the key ones, you could see $50,000 to $100,000 difference. It's a couple of examples: Kelvin Grove State High, Brisbane State High, Indooroopilly State High, Mansfield State High. Therefore, at the top state high schools, and you do notice a big difference with that pricing. Flooding, naturally, we all live in Brisbane. I probably don't have to explain that in too much detail. Interestingly enough, if you live near a flood zone, the flood maps are being updated on the 1st of September this year. And apparently there's another 10,000 plus properties that are going onto the flood map. So if you're borderline and you've never flooded, there's a risk that you may end up on a flood map anyway. Flight paths, the council have actually now taken these maps down because flight paths seem to be constantly changing, and I think there's whinging from everyone around the state. So we will take into account if there's heavy flight noise going over the top, but we're not as stressed about what particular path there is. Obviously zoning, if you're going to buy a property, you want peace and quiet and enjoyment, you don't want apartments looking over you, well, that's going to be a pretty critical check to do just to make sure that everything is zoned low density around you as well. Other things we take into account, because when we do buy an investment property, we're very much looking at that owner-occupier appeal. We want an emotional buyer coming and buying this in the future when you want to sell. So we consider the aspect of the home. We'll look at west facing at the rear in Brisbane, obviously less favourable getting smashed by the sun, unless you've got some exceptional view to sort of offset that. Easements, underground infrastructure, so your pipes, if people want to put a pool in the backyard, things like that, we need to take all of that into account. Walkability and the flow of the floor plan. So the walkability factor, going back probably, I've been doing this for 18 years as a buyer's agent and 23 as a valuer. And the walkability never used to be as critical an element as it has become in the modern society. So when we're buying assets for clients now as an investment property that they might hold for 10, 15, 20 years, we have to look at that population period and the younger generation coming through and going, how are they being brought up? Where are they living? What are they looking for in a property as a home? So a lot of that is cafe culture, lock up and leave factor, to be able to go to the coast on a weekend. They don't want the big block in the huge yard anymore. They want a small block with a smaller yard, just space for the dog, and that's pretty much it. So we've got to take into account all of these things from an investment perspective, looking for home buyers in the future. The flow of your floor plan, an example of that might be, if you looked in Chapel Hill, for instance, predominantly it's families with young children. Right, so if you've got a master bedroom on one level and all the other bedrooms on another level, that property will struggle to sell. It will never achieve a premium price. It'll sit there, and it's always going to be harder to rent as well. So you have to take that into account with your selection of asset in an area. So we then also do a check of percentage of renters. We're looking at demographics, ethnicities, all sorts of things, just to make sure that we're not sort of getting into this sort of fractional percent of a market. We're trying to make sure that the asset we've got is appealing to the broader sense of the market. So that's a whole heap of the elements that we take into account. Excuse me. So what can you actually buy in the different markets now and in the different areas, and what does that actually cost for you to hold that asset? So if we talk about Brisbane first, I'm sure there's some first home buyers there sort of thinking, what can we actually get these days and how competitive is it? That anything up to about 1.4 to 1.5 million in Brisbane is a highly competitive market at the moment. If you're within that 15-kilometre ring, you would, if you're out there having a look, you'll probably realise there's somewhere between 20 and potentially 40 or 50 groups going through the first open home when it goes live. A lot of properties are selling the first week or two. Houses entry level is about 950k now. And that's talking sort of Moreton Bay region or sort of your Bray Parks, your Strathpines, your Brackenridge, Redcliffe areas. So you're having to go 25 plus kilometres north to buy in at around that sort of price point. If you want to come within a 15k radius, you're more needing about 1.1 or above. And probably be prepared to have to do a little bit of cosmetic improvement at that level as well. Townhouses, so if we take the next step down, that's very much become a lifestyle alternative to owning a house. As I was talking about earlier, that walkability factor, that convenience factor is becoming higher on people's priority list. So townhouses entry level now on about that sort of 7 to 12k radius is about 950. So these are moving extremely quickly. Ideally, if you can get something a bit more unique, get it on a corner where you get wraparound courtyards or a double garage, just so it's not your typical centre townhouse where you get no light from either side. You still have to take into effect that comfort of living. Units, 750 plus. You can buy units cheaper than that. There's definitely still units out there at 600 and 650, but if you're wanting something that is quality, smaller, a little bit more boutique complex, body corporate's in a reasonable range, not at sort of that $7,000-8,000 a year. In Brisbane in particular, we wouldn't say buy units much more than 6 or 7 Ks from the city. We aren't a big enough population with a good enough public transport network that you can push that far out, still have convenience of apartment living. So we'd still say pretty close. So the yield expectations, you can see there, houses around 3 to 3.5%. Your apartments and your townhouses are more around that 4%. Almost all of Brisbane's yields are sitting below, about 1% below our historical averages. So your holding costs are that bit higher than they used to be. So in Melbourne, it's actually not that dissimilar. And this is where, from a value perspective, when you look at Melbourne, you're going, well, in a city that's more than, I think it's almost twice Brisbane's size, your pricing is very, very similar to what you get in Brisbane. Yields are a little bit lower though. So most of your yields in Melbourne are around 0.5 to 0.75% worse off than Brisbane. So that holding cost on about a 1.1 asset ends up being about an extra $6,000 or $7,000 a year. But from an investment perspective, Melbourne looks like it's obviously at the bottom of the cycle. The holding costs, to give you an idea, this is on an assumption that, as Josh was talking about, you can borrow 95%. Interest rate, we're still running out there at about 6%. Josh indicated it can get a bit better, so that's it should make these look a little bit prettier than the numbers look at the moment. But these numbers I'm talking about are pre-tax, no depreciation offset, and it's just assuming you bought it as an investment property and renting it out market rate. It does take into account management fees, rates, water, insurance, an allowance of 10% of your rent going towards maintenance each year, that sort of thing. So that's roughly the sort of numbers you're talking about in around Brisbane now. If you had a 1.2 house further out, your yield might be a fraction higher because there's more value in the improvements than the land. But if you're on that 15k ring, that's roughly the sort of numbers you're talking about now. And Melbourne, as I said earlier, is about $6,000 or $7,000 more for a house, about $4,000 to $5,000 more for the townhouses and units. Why are these averages still looking so bad at the moment? Obviously, interest rates are still quite high compared to the norm, and the speed and growth of our property market from a capital perspective hasn't slowed enough to allow the rents to catch up. So at the moment, the capital is still creating this gap with your rental yields. That will close in the years ahead when the Brisbane market starts to level off a little bit more. Rental will start to creep up a little bit as the capital growth levels out. So what do we actually think the property market is going to do? This is the question we get on the daily. What's the growth rate going to be? How much is Brisbane going to perform? I'll say from the outset, we very much avoid making any predictions on where we think the market will go. All we can do is run a lot of data analytics. We can base off our historical growth rates, and we can look at what the buying market is really looking for in properties. So at the moment, house and unit stock is still extremely low. So if you are out there looking for a property, for quality property, you'll probably go through 8 terrible looking homes and you find one that looks reasonable. And you'll find that there's people queued up at the door ready to go for that. Stock levels are down still about 25% year on year for 12 months. Even coming into spring, there doesn't seem to be a big influx of property coming from all the agents we're talking to. And in Brisbane alone, we talked about 650 agents a week, 2 to 3 times a week. So we get a pretty good feel of what's actually going on there. Population growth is still outpacing construction. Construction pricing has leveled out from a materials perspective, but the labour is still high. And the ability to get labour is going to get harder and harder once our infrastructure projects start to get going. I don't know if any of you were building when or doing a renovation when Queen's Wharf was being built, but when that happened, it reached a point where they started fitting out all of the bathrooms, so you could not get a plumber or a tiler to save yourself without paying an absolute fortune. That will happen again as we get close to fitting out a stadium with however many bathrooms it's got and all the other facilities we're going to do, because we're going to have to bring in skilled labour and we don't have the housing to put them in. So it'll be an interesting dynamic as to how the construction goes over the next 5 to 7 years. Demand for Queensland is still strong. That's both Gold Coast, Sunshine Coast and Brisbane. It is still strong, obviously everything leading into the Olympics. So all of this would indicate that the values will still improve. By how much is really the question. From our perspective, we feel it can't keep running at the speed it has been running for the last 4 or 5 years. It's not a sustainable rate of growth. So we would expect that Brisbane might have another 6 to 12 months before it levels out a little bit more, might have a stagnation period for a couple of years, and then leading into the Olympics, we'd expect a little bit more of a run again. So what do I need to do if you're actually going out there and buying your first home? So obviously get your finance pre-approved. It's absolutely key. The amount of people we see in the market that we come up against, and we can beat them on terms in a heartbeat because they just haven't done anything about their finance yet. They want to have a 14-day finance clause. If you've got your pre-approval and you stay within your pre-approval and you don't go crazy on the value of the property, 9 times out of 10 you can probably get away without a finance clause. Don't let your emotion take over, especially in auction situations. Set your limit beforehand. Don't set your limit on the day. Be willing to walk away and know that there'll be something else. Don't rush your property journey. Be willing to act quickly when you find the right property. So don't have a hesitation in acting quickly, but don't rush out and just buy the first thing you see just for the sake of it. We see a lot of buyer's remorse come through in the marketplace when that happens. And really study that market. Like, you've got to have a look at the sales that are going on in the area. Don't be afraid to call an agent if you see something's under contract on the internet that's similar to what you're looking at, and ask them what it's sold for. The agents are happy to try and give you a little bit of information. They'll pretend to be your best mate. They're not really, but definitely get a good feel as to what's happening here and now, not looking at your sales from 6 months ago. So then what? So you've got your ducks in a line, you're ready to act, you've got your finance done, so you're ready to actually go out and buy something. When you select the property, stop looking at the furniture and everything else that's going on. Stop looking at what other people are looking at. Actually look at the property itself. So get underneath, have a look at the stumps, look at the gutters, look at the paintwork on the outside. Open those timber windows that are probably sealed shut because the agents come through with a paint spray gun and they're all locked shut. So think about what's actually going to cost you money when you actually go to move into that property. Open all the cupboards, see if the doors closed properly and they're not jammed. Things like that, where you know it's going to be something you're going to have to spend the money on otherwise. Befriend the sales agent is absolutely key. It may go against the grain of all of you. It goes against me, and I'm a buyer's agent, but we have to pump the agent's ego. We have to talk them up and tell them how great they are. Really try and get them as much information as we possibly can about what's going on. Read the building and pest report if there has been one given to you. Call the inspector. Don't be afraid to do that. They're always happy to take those calls. If you're concerned, you think you've seen things that they haven't done, then be willing to go and get your own building and pest done as well. $600 or $700 is probably the best money you can spend on a building and pest side of things. And then do your due diligence, check your sales in the area, work out what you think the property's worth, and run with that. Obviously, then you've done that, you're now negotiating, you're talking to the agent, set your limit beforehand, know where you're willing to walk away and where you're not, know when you're willing to spend a bit more. Don't lowball at the moment. Like, in this market, you can try and lowball and you'll get disregarded instantly. So even if you were willing to pay what it ends up selling for, the agent won't engage with you if you just come in and fully lowball them. They'll just disregard you completely. They won't call you back. They won't give you anything else. And then you've got no chance of buying the property. You can come in lower, but keep it within the realms of reality of what that property could be worth. So if it's worth between $950 and $1 million, you can come in at $935 or $950. That's fine, but don't come in at $850, $890, $900. It's just not going to work for you. For an auction, be prepared. Obviously, if you drop of the hammer, that's yours. You can't get out of it. You're going to have to pay the deposit on the day, and you're going to have to call your broker and tell them that you bought a property at auction that's $100,000 beyond your pre-approval. That's going to get you in a lot of trouble and could end up in a big default situation. So make sure you stay within your limits on auction day. If you are worried about that, you can hire people purely to bid on your behalf. We do an auction bidding service where a client can say, I hate it, I'm worried about it, I don't know what it's worth, freaks me out, don't want to deal with it. They can engage someone purely to bid on their behalf with a preset limit and condition. If you're unsure, ask your broker about getting a report from RP Data. At least it might give you a guide of the value. Ask your solicitor to do any checks of the contract, or you can look at engaging a buyer's agent, that sort of thing. So, but make sure you befriend the agent as much as you can. The closer you are to them, chances are they'll give you more information. So should you buy now or should you wait? And a lot of this will just be dependent on your current financial situation. Can you afford it? Interest rates now, the good thing about where we are now is that we're probably past that peak. So it's unlikely they're going up. If anything, they're staying level or coming down. So if you're running your cash flows and affordability piece now and you're comfortable with that, chances are it's going to get better. So you just have to consider going, at what stage of the cycle are we? Are we at the right time that I want to get in? Do I want to buy a home? Am I going to rent best? Going down that path, and then where do you think you should actually buy? So when you are getting into that negotiation piece, we find that the agents, because we are dealing with them day in, day out, they'll give us a lot more information than the majority of other buyers. So if you're going to be in the marketplace, you're going to be regularly, make your agent your best friend and take that advice from there. So hopefully that's been very informative for you. Hopefully it gives you a bit of an idea as to what we're seeing in the markets and